A Great Argead Saga Alexander the Great. Volume 2, Hieros Lachus, The Sacred Band. By Macaulay Naki. Episode 16, Persia Satrapal Threshold. Tattered Tether. The western rim of the great king's empire did not merely bleed silver, it festered. By the raw, biting gales of October 368 BC, the provinces of Asia Minor were a tinderbox awaiting nothing more than a spark to consume the house of Achaemenes from within. From the marble-veiled peristyles of Decilium down to the sun-baked, salt-crusted flats of Cilicia, the air smelled of ozone, wood smoke, and suppressed mutiny. Every garrison post fell heavy with the collective weight of men who knew their service bought only the chains of their own servitude. Far to the east, across thousands of stadia of desert and high plateau, the gilded, scent-drenched halls of Susa remained sealed in a glittering slumber. There, King Artaxerxes II sat upon his carved cedar throne, completely blind to the rot eating away his western limbs. To the aging monarch, surrounded by the sweet hum of lyres and the flutter of silk curtains, the empire still breathed as it always had, anchored by an invisible, absolute weight of divine royal wool maintained through a delicate, spiderweb network of provincial governors. And standing silently just beyond the fringe of the king's dais, draped in robes of dyed silk that whispered against the mosaic floor like dry leaves, was Bagos. With eyes downcast and a face as impassive as a carved bas-relief, the royal eunuch absorbed everything. He missed neither the nervous twitch of a courtier's thumb nor the careless arrogance with which the aging monarch waved away the first reports of fiscal strain. To Bagos, who mapped the empire not by its provinces, but by its vulnerabilities, the king's blindness was merely another instrument to be measured, weighed, and ultimately manipulated. He moved through the glittering halls like a shadow cast by the throne itself, ever watching, ever recording which satraps paid in full, and which ones hoarded their silver for the inevitable reckoning. Let the satraps collect the tribute, Artaxerxes would remind his inner council with a careless sweeping wave of a jeweled hand, his eyes fixed on a dancing girl turning beneath the chandeliers. Let them squeeze the Greek cities of the coast until the copper rings in our vaults. An empire's true greatness is measured entirely by the gold it pours into the royal treasury. In the dim periphery, Bagos inclined his head ever so slightly, his expression betraying nothing. Let him count his gold, while the foundations crack, the eunuch thought, his mind already calculating the shifting loyalties across the Taurus Mountains. A treasury filled with coin is useless if the hands holding the keys belong to men with knives. Yet, behind closed doors in the western satrapies, local governors looked upon those relentless tax demands not as a sacred duty, but as a slow, strangling noose wrapping tighter around their necks with every passing month. Decades of unyielding imperial extraction, combined with the capricious, bloody whims of a court that elevated favorite one season, only to execute him the next, had eaten away the last fibers of loyalty along the Aegean and Mediterranean littorals. Satrap Ariobarzanes stood motionless in the shadows of his private solar, the bitter mountain wind rattling the heavy wool curtains. Late one night, by the dying embers of a cedarwood hearth, he stared down at the heavy gold seal of a Lespontine Phrygia, clutched in his palm. "He demands more gold for his levies," Ariobarzanes muttered into the empty, fire-lit gloom, his jaw tightening until the bones ached. He sits in the sun, listening to eunuchs and sycophants whisper sweet lies, while we bleed our garrisons dry fighting his phantom border wars. If we pay his extortionate price for yet another year, there will be nothing left of our provinces to govern but skeletons and ash. Across the regional borders, hidden away in the cold, fortress-crowned keeps of Cappadocia, men like Datames were already sharpening their blades in the dark, watching the western horizon for the first structural crack in the royal facade. The imperial tether to Susa was fraying, strand by brittle strand, and the wolves were finally gathering, unseen, for now, by everyone except the quiet shadow standing patiently in the king's hall. The ledger rolls were soaked in olive oil to preserve the parchment, but no amount of oil could mask the stench of ruin. In the high administrative bureau of Sardis, the stylus scratched against the papyrus with a dry, relentless rasp. Mithridates, a royal scribe whose eyes had long ago gone dim from counting imperial tribute, set the reed down and rubbed his aching wrists. Before him sat the latest dispatch from the great king's tax inspectors in Susa, a parchment stamped with the unyielding red seal of the royal treasury. The arithmetic of empire was simple, brutal, and entirely detached from the dirt of the western provinces. More silver. Always more silver. To fund Artaxerxes' endless distant campaigns and maintain the lavish pageantry of the eastern court, the imperial tax quotas assigned to the western satraps had risen year after year, like a rising tide. The provincial governors were expected to extract blood from stone, squeezing towns that were already hollowed out by bad harvests and crippled trade. In the crowded market squares of the Ionian coast, the weight of that decree fell not upon the satraps, but upon the backs of the common folk. Local peasants, olive growers, and dockworkers bore the entire brunt of the extraction. Every bushel of grain, every amphora of wine, and every silver coin carried away to the east left another family closer to starvation. "They are driving us to the whip's edge," muttered a veteran tax collector, staring out the arched window at a group of sullen villagers muttering in the courtyard below. "They think the provinces are a bottomless pit. If we squeeze them another grain, there won't be a revolt of soldiers, there will be a revolt of ghosts." Inside the private chamber of the regional governor's estate, the satrap listened to the scribe's report with a cold, hardened expression. He walked slowly to the balcony, looking out over the sprawling, restless city. The great king sits in his golden palace, demanding coin to pay mercenaries who care nothing for our homes, the satrap thought, his fingers tightening around the carved stone railing until his knuckles turned white. He leaves us to face the fury of our own people, acting as his executioners. If we continue to enforce his greed, the populace will tear us apart with their bare hands. But if we turn our faces away from Susa, if we use this anger instead of crushing it, the crown will find that a starving province is a very dangerous hound to keep on a leash. Down in the dusty streets below, a crowd began to gather around the public notice boards, their eyes fixed on the latest royal tax assessment. The murmur of discontent was no longer a whisper. It was a low, rumbling tide waiting for a leader brave enough to point it toward the east. The marble-pillared peristyle of the governor's villa in Decilium smelled of salt air, crushed mint, and unwashed wool. It was a strange, restless scent, the distinct aroma of the borderlands where the great king's eastern administrative boundaries bled directly into the chaotic, argumentative vitality of the Greek world. Satrap Ariobarzanes stood in the shadows of the open colonnade, watching a bitter argument unfold across the courtyard. Two men were nearly coming to blows over a spilled cup of unwatered Thasian wine. A scarred veteran Spartan mercenary captain with a matted beard, and an exiled Athenian orator whose robes were frayed at the hem. They were the ghosts and hounds of the Aegean, men cast out by shifting hegemonies, recycled through decades of war from the Corinthian fields to the Peloponnesian shores, and now washing up on the Anatolian coast looking for silver and blood. First the Spartans cracked our walls with their arrogance. Now the Thebans march under the shadow of Leuctra, and the Athenians circle like gulls over every harbor. Ariobarzanes thought, his gaze narrowing as he watched the Spartan captain slam a heavy bronze coin onto the stone table. Every time the Greek cities tear each other apart, they throw off flotsam. And we pick it up. For years, the geopolitical game had forced the Western satraps into an intimate, dangerous dance with these interlopers. Susa demanded peace, yet Susa's own fractured policies required the hiring of thousands of foreign hoplites and naval captains to police unruly borders. But something far more perilous had shifted. The satraps were no longer merely paying for seasonal guard duty. They were forging direct, independent blood and iron bonds that bypassed the great king's oversight entirely. The Athenian exile stepped closer to the satrap, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial hiss that cut through the noise of the courtyard. "You waste your breath relying on royal decrees from the east, my lord," the Athenian murmured, his eyes glittering with opportunistic ambition. "Artaxerxes sits too far away to hear the clank of bronze on your own borders. The hoplites in your camps do not swear oaths to a throne 3 months right across the desert. They swear to the hand that pours the coin." Ariobarzanes turned his head slowly, looking the Greek dead in the eye. He speaks the truth, the satrap realized, a cold, hard thrill cutting through his exhaustion. We have built our armies not with Persian levies, but with Greek steel. Every mercenary captain we buy, every exiled commander we shelter, weaves a new thread of loyalty that anchors here, not in Susa. And if the great king asks by whose authority we garrison these coastlines with 10,000 Hellenic spears? Ariobarzanes asked quietly, his voice like the scrape of a sword leaving its scabbard. The Athenian smiled, a thin, predatory grin. By the authority of the men who actually hold the swords, my lord. The king is far away. The sea is right here. Act 1, Scene Ive, the leopard of Cappadocia. The wind howling down from the jagged peaks of the Anti-Taurus Mountains tasted of ice and raw iron. Inside the stone-vaulted citadel of Mazaca, high upon the Anatolian plateau, Datames stood before a roaring brazier, staring down at a sand table carved with the topographical ridges of his province. The firelight flickered across a face weather-beaten by decades of frontier warfare, casting sharp predatory shadows over his heavy brow. He was not merely a governor who collected taxes for a distant throne. He was a master of stratagem, a commander whose mind worked in serpentine folds, anticipating every possible chess move before his adversary had even unlatched his sword belt. Susa believes Cappadocia is just a wide, quiet pasture to be sheared at will, Datames thought, his dark eyes narrowing as he gripped a small wooden marker representing an imperial garrison. They think because we are landlocked and silent, we are tame. They do not understand that the mountains breed patience. And when a leopard waits in the snow, he is not sleeping, he is measuring the distance to the throat. For months, the covert resistance had found its beating heart right here. While other satraps whispered cautiously behind closed curtains in Sardis or Hellespontine Phrygia, Datames had already begun testing the absolute limits of royal patience. He had quietly reinforced mountain passes, replaced Persian magistrates, with battle-tested veterans loyal only to his banner, and delayed imperial tax caravans under the polite, feigned excuse of bandit raids. A heavy wooden door creaked open behind him. Commander Ariobarzanes, his most trusted lieutenant, stepped into the chill chamber, shaking the mountain frost from his heavy leather cloak. The royal dispatch riders from Susa have reached the lower outpost, my lord, Ariobarzanes reported, his voice low and tight with tension. They carry a direct sealed scroll from the king's chamberlain. They demand to know why our autumn tribute is 3 months overdue, and why our western frontier garrisons have been doubled without royal authorization. Datames did not turn away from the sand table. A slow, cold smile touched the corners of his mouth. Let them demand, Datames thought, the adrenaline of impending rebellion singing in his veins. Let Artaxerxes send his ink-stained inspectors and his threats of royal wrath. Words written on parchment in a sun-drenched palace cannot cross these frozen gorges unless I allow it. He picked up a bronze stylus, tapping it rhythmically against the wooden table. Tell the royal inspectors they are welcome to ascend to the citadel, Ariobarzanes, Datames said softly, his voice cutting through the crackle of the fire. Provide them with warm wine and comfortable quarters. Ariobarzanes raised an eyebrow, surprised. You intend to let them inspect the ledgers, my lord? Only the ledgers we wish them to see, Datames replied, turning to face his lieutenant with a gaze as sharp as a drawn blade. Let them report back to Susa that we are merely reorganizing our defense against local mountain tribes. Lull the great king into a false sense of security for just one more season. While Susa sleeps, we build an army that will make the entire empire tremble, stones against the crown. The map spread across the trestle table was not drawn on fine Egyptian papyrus, but scraped onto cured goat hide, rough, ridged with veins of dried gristle, and stained with the dark purple of spilled ink and mountain wine. Datames ran a scarred thumb down the jagged contour lines representing the Cilician gates, that cruel narrow slit in the Taurus range, where 100 men could hold back an empire. Beyond those stone jaws lay the plains of Syria, Susa, and the infinite golden reach of the great king. But here, inside the high-altitude silence of Cappadocia, the mountains belonged to no king save the one who could buy the passes. Artaxerxes thinks his royal decrees are iron, Datames thought, his eyes tracing the red wax markers he had placed along every strategic defile from Tyana to Mazaca. He believes an empire is held together by roads and heralds. He does not know the deadlier truth. An empire is held together only by the blood of the men standing in the dark at the top of the pass. A sudden gust of wind rattled the heavy wool curtains over the arched doorway, bringing with it the bitter chill of the upcoming winter. Beside him stood Captain Sizines, a grizzled Cappadocian veteran, whose face looked as though it had been hacked out of granite with a dull axe. "The work on the upper redoubts is finished," my lord Sizines muttered, keeping his voice low despite the empty vaulted corridors of the keep. "The masons have doubled the thickness of the curtain walls at the gorge. But the foreign captains are growing restless. The Greek hoplites we recruited from the coast want their silver paid in full, and they are beginning to ask whose banner they are truly sharpening their spear points for." Datames did not look up from the hide. He kept his gaze fixed on the narrow bottleneck of the mountain pass, where a single company of well-placed archers could turn an entire imperial legion into a slaughterhouse. "Tell the Greek captains their silver is ready, Sizines," Datames replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried the absolute authority of a warlord who knew his survival depended on cold calculation. "Tell them they serve the only power in Asia that still pays on time, the power that holds the high ground." Sizines hesitated, his weathered brow furrowing as he glanced toward the eastern horizon, as if he could see all the way to the royal palaces of Susa. "And when the great king's spies finally realize what we are doing here, when the royal armies march north through these very passes," Datames finally raised his head. A dark, dangerous fire burned in his eyes, the cool, unblinking focus of a predator that had spent years backing into a corner, only to find he had brought a sword. "Let Artaxerxes send his legions," Datames whispered, leaning forward over the map. "We are not waiting for him to break down our gates anymore. We are building a fortress out of the mountains themselves, and when the crown shatters against it, Susa will learn what happens when you try to chain a leopard in the snow." The parchment lay flat on the cedar desk, smelling faintly of rancid fish, glue, and royal dust. It was an official dispatch from the Imperial Secretariat in Susa, demanding an immediate accounting of the delayed silver shipments from the Cappadocian treasury. Datames picked up a heavy bronze stylus, turning it slowly in his calloused fingers. He did not rush to write a reply period. Instead, he let the silence stretch across the vaulted chamber, savoring the delicate, razor-thin tension that hummed between the lines of the royal seal. To declare open war now would be the act of a madman, Datames thought, his gaze drifting out the narrow window toward the frost-bitten hills where his frontier guard stood watch. A suicidal rush to the sword is what Susa expects. They want us to scream defiance so they can crush us in the open field like dogs. But a war of nerves, that is a game played with shadows. He dipped the stylus into a shallow well of dark ink, his expression calm, almost serene. Rather than sending flat defiance, he would send compliance wrapped in a web of bureaucratic poison. He meticulously altered a clause regarding local administrative jurisdiction, subtly reinterpreting the great king's royal edicts to grant his own courts absolute autonomy over provincial revenues. Let them parse the language in Susa, a thin, predatory smile touching his lips. By the time their legalists realize I have rewritten their own laws to strip them of tax authority here, the winter snows will have locked the mountain passes tight. We test the leash, inch by inch, to see how much weight the king's patience can bear before it snaps. Miles to the northwest, across the rolling hills of Phrygia, that very game of calculated friction was already sending shockwaves through the western provinces. In the sunlit courtyard of his palace at Dacilium, Satrap Ariobarzanes stared down at a courier's report, detailing Datames' latest bureaucratic sleight of hand. The Cappadocian satrap had once again delayed his tribute, offering polite, infuriatingly vague excuses about regional banditry, while keeping every last silver derrick safely inside his own treasury. Ariobarzanes traced his fingers along the edge of the papyrus, his breath catching in his throat as the profound implication of the act settled over him. He is doing it, Ariobarzanes thought, his heart hammering against his ribs as a mixture of terror and intoxicating liberation flooded his veins. Datames is dancing right on the razor's edge, and the great king's ministers in Susa are powerless to stop him without starting a conflagration. Ariobarzanes looked up, catching the anxious, waiting gaze of his own chief treasurer, who stood nervously by the arched doorway. "My lord," the treasurer whispered, breaking the heavy silence. "What instructions shall we send to the tax collectors in the interior? Do we dispatch the autumn quota to Susa as demanded?" Ariobarzanes let out a low, dark chuckle, folding the report and sliding it safely into his tunic. The careful hesitation that had paralyzed the western satraps for a decade suddenly vanished, burned away by the spark coming out of the Cappadocian mountains. Tell them the treasury is empty, Ariobarzanes said, his voice dropping into a steady, resolute command. Tell them Susa will have to wait, because the royal center is no longer the only power in the west. To be continued in episode 17, Story of Thebes' Unbreakable Heart. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesia's Playlist. Volume 2, Hieros Lachus, the Sacred Band Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 2. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.